this week we're going to jump into the Apiaceae family and the Amaranthaceae family, specifically for the Apiaceae carrots and parsnips and celery and celeriac, and then Amaranthaceae, beets and chard, and spinach. So we'll have some new terms this week and kind of a deeper dive into biennials. So we're going to focus on carrots, and we're not going to talk much at all about parsnips themselves. We're essentially going to treat parsnips and carrots interchangeably with a few exceptions that I'll point out. But basically everything that's true for carrots in what we're about to say is also true for parsnips, with one grand exception that parsnips are much cold hardier. So we can discuss that a bit when we get there. Celery and celeriac, just so we're all on the same page, they are both Apium graveolens. They are sometimes listed with subspecies, but they are cross-compatible, so they will pollinate with each other. So unless you're doing some fancy footwork with isolation or you have a lot of space, then you have to choose your lane, celery or celeriac, whichever one you'd like to save seed from. So carrots, and also parsnips by extension, are biennials. So just for refreshing purposes, that means it spends its first season putting on vegetal growth and then needs a period of cold and called vernalization, which we'll do a quick review of, and then wakes back up after vernalization with flowering energy and spends the next growing season producing a flower and seed. It's a dry seeded crop, so no fermentation or scooping necessary. The flower type is perfect flower, meaning it has all the requisite parts to pollinate itself and self-compatible, but it is protandrous. So this is a new term, meaning even though the flower structure itself is a perfect flower, it has both pollen and ovaries, the mechanism, evolutionarily speaking, is such that the pollen is shed before the stigma is receptive, meaning before the top of the tube leading down to the ovary, the style tube, before that is receptive. So that's a built-in mechanism to ensure high diversity and cross-pollination with insects. So meaning essentially one carrot, even though it has all the parts, is not going to produce viable seed in almost all circumstances. Carrots and also parsnips are insect pollinated, and the big thing to think about with carrots is that they are cross-compatible with Queen Anne's lace, the wild carrot. So pay special attention to your garden edges or nearby roadsides or adjacent fields or wherever it is if you're interested in growing carrots for seed. Historically, for those of you who might be taking this as a review, we have recommended not growing carrots because of this cross-compatibility issue. But essentially, if you know your adjacent fields and your garden and your land that you're growing, farming, gardening on, then you can make the judgment as to how susceptible you might be to cross-pollination. There are some fancy footwork, sort of the 201 class, as to how to isolate for pollination, which we've gotten into before, which basically involves putting a pollination cage over the carrots that are flowering and introducing a pollinator like flies or bees. But that's really tricky, and if anyone's really interested in that, we can talk about it at the end. What you see in the background here is not actually carrots. Those are parsnips, but it's just driving the point home that these parsnips are exceptionally large. It must have been a good year at Aurelia's garden. But staking is crucial, and we've mentioned this just a little bit so far with biennials, especially because with biennials, we're dealing with something where we're growing the root or the bulb, and then we're storing it, and then we're planting it back out. And it's not just going to be a little plant anymore. It's going to be a tall, anywhere from 4 to 7 foot. That's so. Wow. Well, staking is crucial, but not absolutely imperative. Hannah's informing me that in this picture, they actually weren't staked. So I'm seeing lines behind it. I guess that's the deer fencing. Yeah. So parsnips, especially certain varieties of parsnips, have a very strong stem. So these are standing tall and proud. But generally speaking, with something like carrots or other biennials, it's important to think about how you might be able to trellis or stake something up. We generally use the Florida weave, which is what commercial growers often use for tomatoes. So that's just a stake about every 8 to 10 feet, and you're weaving twine or tomato wire or something, tomato twine, something like that, around each stake on both sides, just to keep things standing nice and tall and proud. But just something to consider. And it's always easier when you're planting biennials out, if you are going to stake, which, in most cases you should, to hammer those stakes in before things start flowering. Because if you're trying to meander your way in there when things are all abloom, you're going to be discouraging your pollinator friends, and you're also going to have a lot more delicate work navigating around those plants. So consider the staking at the time of planting. So isolation distance for these, 800 feet to a mile. You make the judgment call. The farther, the better. And because of the protandrous nature, like we were talking about before, because the pollen sets before the stigma is receptive on each flower, you want to make sure that you have at least 5 if you're trying to get viable seed for carrots or parsnips. Ideally, you want something on the higher side, 120 to 200 plants for long-term genetic maintenance. But as we've discussed before, just for review, there are creative ways around this if you have a small space. If you can only plant 20 or so at a time, there's ways to reintroduce genetics via old seed or share seed with friends and have everybody grow a little bit and so forth. So anybody interested in expanding the borders of their gardens and really excited about growing this, don't be discouraged by those population sizes. So for storage and vernalization, mulching in ground with carrots, I'm told, is possible. I don't do it for a number of reasons. Carrots are not nearly as hardy as parsnips. So parsnips, you can leave them in the ground in a New England winter in almost everywhere except for the northernmost areas. They're going to be just fine. Carrots, however, can melt when they get much below 20 degrees for extended periods of time. So that's one consideration. The second consideration is if you're mulching, which makes mulching and keeping them in ground over winter possible in the first place, you're also introducing a wonderful habitat for rodents in the winter time. We have not had a season where we have mulched something that is tasty in the winter that rodents have not had their fill. So you're creating that habitat in your farm or garden with some delicious sweet treats buried underneath. The other reason is because if you're not simply saving seed, but actively doing selection, which should always be one and the same. Every time we're saving seed to the best of our abilities, we want to be doing selection. We want to be saving from the best and healthiest plants. You can't get a good idea about what that carrot or parsnip's doing unless you dig it up and look at it. So if you're thinking about selecting against, root rot or canker or avoiding carrots with those wonderful legs or intertwined around one another, general shape and size, things like that, then you want to dig them up. And you should turn them into stecklings, which we're going to talk about in just a second. And stecklings also have an advantage when you're cutting in, just to mention this before I get into it, that you're able to see what's going on a little bit inside the core of the carrot itself. So that gives you the opportunity to look to see if maybe there's a pithiness where the outside of the carrot is separating from that inside core. You can check for color if you have a carrot that's, let's say, purple on the skin, but orange on the interior. So it also gives you a chance to look at things on the inside as well as the outside. So I have a slide for what stecklings look like that I'll show you in just a second. But essentially, it's this. You want to brush off the soil as gently as possible. So it's particularly important if you can get away with it to harvest your roots for storage on a drier day so you're not bringing mud in. It makes them easier to just brush off. But you don't want to rinse them, and you don't want to scrub them vigorously. Reason being, there is increasing scientific data supporting the fact that when we wash these carrots, we're also potentially washing away an entire microbiome on the outside of those carrots. And we are encouraging opportunities for rot to come in. And similarly with overbrushing, you're not just brushing the biome off per se, you're also potentially scratching into that carrot itself and introducing more opportunities for disease to encroach. So after you do that, we'll see in the next slide, we're going to top the roots right above the crown to about 1 inch. And then we're going to remove any portion of the taproot, so that's the bottom part of our carrot here, that's longer than anywhere from 3 to 4.5 inches. And these want to be stored with about 90% moisture, a pretty moist environment after you've given them a day to kind of cure from their cutting, or even a couple hours. So moist sand is fine. Wood shavings, also fine. We've used them pretty often. If you can use plastic bags, they're not the most recommended, but if you do choose to use them, vented plastic bags are ones that have perforations on them of some sort. So In the commercial growing world, there are 25-pound root vegetable bags that we store carrots in for production all winter, most of the winter. And those work well enough. It's just that if there's not enough airflow internally there, then there are more opportunities for it to rot than if it were in moist sandalwood shavings. So something to think about. Here's the recap on vernalization. So you want about 10 to 12 weeks at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's going to make the magic happen where that vegetable energy is converted and the carrot will wake up out of storage and be ready to flower and produce seed. So here's a wonderful picture, visualization from the organic seed growing by our late friend and mentor, Dr. John Navazio. So you can see how close those carrot stecklings are being trimmed up by the apical bud. It's an upward cut, and it's usually done in 2 or 3 cuts. You basically start right at the top of that carrot, and you're cutting upward at a slight angle, and that's where you get that wonderful little angle there. And you can look in the middle if you're looking very closely at the screen, which I am now, obviously. And there's a little bit of sort of orange poking out of the middle of where that green is around where all the petioles were. And that is what's known as the apical bud. So that is where your stem is going to emerge in flowering. So it looks like it's dangerously close, but really what you're trying to do is cut as much material off as possible because that's material that will rot in storage. And then on the bottom there, you can see cut at a very slight angle off the bottom are the tap roots. So anywhere from 3 to 4.5 inches, that's giving you all the vegetal energy that you need to replant. It's also giving you a chance to look inside the core, and it's also preventing desiccation because that taproot at the very tip will be the first thing to kind of wither up as it's conserving energy. So you've successfully overwintered your carrots somewhere cold. They've vernalized. They're waking up. They're excited. You're planting them in the ground. You can use a similar spacing, 6 inches apart or so, but just keep in mind that when a biennial root wakes up, it's going to have a lot more biomass to support, and it's going to need some space. So it's not always the same planting spacing that you would do if you were just planting for harvest. So you can give them more room, maybe 8 to 10 inches for each carrot, just keeping in mind that the plant and flower is much larger and would benefit from more energy and more space. So you be the judge for that. The best seed when carrots or parsnips are in flower, any umbel. So this also applies to dill and parsley, anything in that umbel family. Your earliest and best seed is what's called the primary umbel, generally known as sometimes the king umbel. But this is basically the center largest flower that emerges from that stalk. That's the one you want to pay most attention to. You can collect side shoots all day and night, and some of that seed will be more viable than others. Some of it might just be light seed, because basically when that earliest and best seed is formed, there's a lot less energy left over for everything that's going on the side. So if you're going for bulk, go for it and harvest as much as you can. But usually, especially on a small scale, the amount of seed you're going to get just from these primary umbels alone is more than enough seed for future plantings and for future diversity. So we recommend just sort of sticking to that primary umbel and then any sort of secondary umbels that come out of that. And when we're saying umbel, this is basically, it's an inflorescence. So it's a composite flower of many little flowers, but they're all emerging from the same area on the stalk. That's what makes them an umbel. It's a very recognizable form that I think I have a picture in future slides for it. So the carrots will flower, the flowers will drop off, and usually the carrot, now young seed head starts to curl in. And what you see there look like young seeds. They're actually fruits made up of 2 seeds that are kind of fused together, that as that fruit starts to dry, they break apart and they are individual seeds. They mature over a long window. So like we've discussed with other crops before, you can harvest them indeterminately, meaning going out and every time you see one of those primary umbels that's turning kind of tannish brown, you can harvest them as needed. But if you're planning on planting a lot of carrots for a larger scale, you can just look at those primary umbels, and when they're about 2/3 of the patch at full maturity, you can cut the stalks or pull the entire plants, lay them down on a tarp. That's the more commercial application for those growing on that scale. If you're growing on a smaller scale, you can tip the umbel over and carefully shake it or tease it with your hands into a bag or a vessel. You can snip the umbel itself and just drop it in to process a little later. Or like we said, cutting whole stalks or pulling plants you can thresh on a tarp. So if you look closely at this picture, this is this sort of nest shape that you see here. There are these little awns, these little spikes that are around all of the seeds on that carrot seed head. Those are something that you usually see rubbed off. It's not crucial to rub them off, but it's pretty easy, which is why we say here, if you're agitating them between your hands very lightly after you've removed them from the umbel, or if you have a very fine mesh screen, you can just gently pass them over the top of the screen and those awns will break right off, and it makes them easier for handling because the design of those is essentially to stick to animals passing by. And so it'll be easier planting for you if you remove those awns, which is very straightforward. Once you've cleaned all that up, carrots are pretty straightforward to winnow just using the air, meaning just taking 2 bins and standing on a little step ladder and without too big of a breeze, dropping them from one bin to the bottom bin and so forth. That will get most of the chaff that's out there if you don't have a lot of stem material still stuck in your carrot seed. Otherwise, screening out some of that stem material first and then doing a pass in the air. You can use a box fan on low, but keep in mind that carrot seed is pretty light. So always recommended to start at a far distance over a tarp and then kind of work your way closer if it's not doing what you want. And then we give those little seeds a snap. And if they break in half and don't bend, then we know they're ready for storage. Apiaceae, celery and celeriac again, both cross-compatible, Apium graveolens. They are also biennials, also a dry seed. Also, same situation here. They're self-compatible and perfect flower structure, but they are usually protandrous, meaning the pollen emerges on the particular flower before the stigma is receptive. And celery and celeriac also are insect pollinated. Similar with isolation distances, because of not having the risk of Queen Anne's lace, we've shrunk the isolation distance to about half a mile. I mean, you could probably go closer on this because I don't. If anybody has neighbors who are growing celery, celeriac, or parcel, all of which are Apium graveolens for seed, then you should have a conversation with them about them because that's great. But generally, it's not a concern. So smaller isolation distances are fine there. Same population size as we saw before. Because of the protandrous nature, you want at least 5 for viable seed. Higher numbers for long-term maintenance and fertilization, as we discussed. So pretty much similar process with celery and celeriac than with carrots and parsnips, except that there's a caveat here that I've experienced and have seen shared in other seed manuals. The primary umbels of celery and celeriac can kind of be obscured because of the way that the umbel grows with those. They're kind of meshed together with other secondary umbels. But you can cut that entire branch down and still, essentially, in my experience, treat it like a primary umbel, and that whole branch should have viable seed there. It's also been my experience, and this is anecdotal largely, but I find that the side shoots of celery and celeriac often have much less viable seed than a carrot or a parsnip would have. Just kind of anecdotal, but that was my experience. So particularly important to focus on those early umbels. Same situation. If you're pulling whole plants or cutting whole plants, wait till about 2/3 of the primary umbels are mature. And anytime you're cutting something when there's not full maturity, just generally speaking, the more of the stalk you can bring in, the better. If you're pulling an entire plant, it's important to consider if you're putting this on a tarp just for review. You don't want to have large soil aggregates or small stones or stuff that are going to be annoying to clean out later and create more work for yourself that way. But if you are pulling entire plants or even cutting a stalk at the base, there's still energy in that plant and it's still sending energy up to those seeds. So they will continue to ripen mature out of the ground. In that case, you'd want to wait at least a week or two before you started trying to clean the seed to give everything a chance to dry down adequately. It's also been my experience, and I think it's pretty common, that celery and celeriac seeds, they're much smaller in size than carrots and parsnips, and they dehisce more easily, meaning if you brush up against the plant, it's not quite as easy as just bending over. You have to be very delicate whenever you're cutting umbels or cutting a branch that they don't just spill right off. Yeah, they almost want to shoot off, unlike carrots that are a little more forgiving because they have those bristly awns and they're sort of sticking together in their nest. So basically what I just said here for processing and storage, just gently brush the seeds off seed heads. So you can tilt that plant over if you have a vessel, a bag, or a bin, and just sort of gently massage those seed heads and the seeds will come right off. That's the cleanest way to get seed. If you're cutting umbels, you can rub them against fine mesh screen after they've finished drying, and then just screen off the chaff. The seeds are really small, so less chaff, the better. It also makes them really challenging to winnow because they're so small. So anytime you can use different colanders or mesh screens to experiment around to try to either get the really fine stuff to drop out or get the seeds themselves to fall out and bigger stuff on top. These really benefit from a good screening and cleaning that way. You can use, your breath as a gentle wind, but I wouldn't recommend, generally speaking, unless it's a very calm day, doing some sort of outdoor winnowing because these seeds can travel very easily. So that's it with celery and celeriac. One thing I didn't say before I move on and open up for questions if there are any, is that celeriac is pretty straightforward. You can give the top a similar cut that we saw with carrots, but it's obviously harder because celeriac are these wonderful, lumpy, frumpy, alien-looking vegetables. It's not as crucial to cut off roots from celeriac, so you don't have to go trimming all those little rootlets off. You can basically leave that celeriac bulb as it is, and even leave some of the rootlets on it, so you don't have to cut it back. In fact, when we've harvested celeriac for seed, we've often pulled the entire base of that plant up, roots and all, soil aggregates and all, and then we've stored that in moist wood shavings because what's going to dry off is going to dry off, but there's enough root mass there that it's not as much of a concern as something long and narrow like a carrot. And with celery, obviously, celery is grown for its stalks. So there's a lot thicker of petiole area where the celery is meeting its root mass. So there's a little more cleaning to get that stuff really well cleaned off because any of those little pieces of celery that are on there are going to want to rot in storage. So take particular attention with celery if you are decided to pull those up and save them for seed, to just cut as much of that off as possible. And then the added bonus is that you have celery you can put in your fridge and enjoy. So we're going to travel next to the Amaranthaceae family and focus specifically on beets and chard and spinach. Just like celery and celeriac, beets and chard are the same genus and species, both beta vulgaris, both cross-compatible, a wonderful testament to human and plant coevolution that along the way, many buddies were focusing on selecting for big, luscious greens and foliage, and many buddies were focusing instead on long storage roots. So beets and chard, beta vulgaris, they're also biennial, also dry seeded. They have a perfect flower structure, but they are self-incompatible, which means that they, in almost all cases, again, always exceptions to the rule, but almost all cases will not receive their own pollen. So very crucial to have a nice large population if you're saving seed from these. They are largely wind pollinated, but we have seen some insects that have indicated that there's also some small amount of insect pollination. I'm thinking particularly of micro wasps, little sweat bees, things like that. How effective they are as pollinators, I'm not exactly sure, but they are not. There's enough reason to believe they're not exclusively wind pollinated. And even if those micro wasps aren't moving a lot of pollen around for you, they're doing other wonderful things in your farm or garden. So keep them around. And on the left here, we see a nice example of a beet that's been prepared for storage on the right-hand side, and a beet on the left-hand side that's been cut along the top. On the left-hand side, the apical bud in there is still intact, but all those little pieces of petiole, all those little stems that are sticking out of there. They're all going to rot in storage. And if you have rot there, then you're just encouraging more rot. So the more you can take that off, the better. And really, as you can see on the right, it's dramatic. I mean, it looks almost like a pyramid. That little teeny tiny point at the top is where that growing bud has emerged. And it's pretty nestled in there along vegetal mass. So it's not like it can snap off super easily either. So don't be afraid to be a little bold and save all that picking of rotting stuff off later. I think we've covered everything on this slide. It's important to say here that the pollen of Amaranthaceae, specifically beets and chard, and also spinach, it's a finer pollen than a lot of other pollens that we've been discussing for things that are cross-compatible, which means when we were discussing isolation cages for other things, it's not something you want to try with this if the isolation cages during pepper week piqued your interest, because that pollen is so fine that it will pass right through most mesh. And it's also important because the pollen can travel farther. So be aware of what neighbors have overwintered or are planting. We're very fortunate in the Northeast that we don't have any substantial sugar beet production. This is a much bigger concern elsewhere in the country, where sugar beets, which is where most of our large portion of our sugar, just labeled sugar, comes from, largely almost exclusively genetically engineered beets. This is a big issue with cross-compatibility, because in big open fields elsewhere in the country with very fine pollen can travel several miles. So all the more reason to take an interest in growing beets and saving seed. There's also an option here. I'll just mention it briefly. This is for anything like beets or radishes or other things where you'd want to get a look inside, but you're not treating them like a steckling, like you would be with a carrot. You can cheek the beet, which means you're basically taking, I don't have a good picture of it, but if you can imagine, we're looking at the beet on the right-hand side, just coming on the side of it, but at a slight angle downward. So you're not cutting too much into the beet. You're just cutting off like a little shallow circle. It's like opening up a window into what's going on inside the beet. So where this is particularly important is if you're doing selection work for something like Chioggia beet, let's say, that has pink and white stripes in it, or you're looking for a certain coloration that you want to maintain on the inside of your beet, this is a way to take a little peek inside and see those rings and see that coloration. It's not necessary in any capacity unless it's something that's a concern for you or a selection criteria, but it's just something that you should be aware of. It's a way of checking and see what's going on inside there. And if you do decide to make this little circular incision, cut that little kind of peeled piece off, you want to just give it a little time, probably a day or two, to dry out a bit before you put it back in, so it's not a fresh cut and doesn't expedite any kind of rot. Here you see a lot of different phases happening in here of seed production. Some stuff is still in flower. Some stuff is almost fully brown. This is a beet that was grown in a hoop house. And if you do decide, I guess this is a good chance to mention this, this was became an exercise on what not to do. It was really nice to have them in this hoop house isolated, not just isolated, but also protected from rain, because one of the things we have to concern ourselves with in the Northeast is when weather is coming in coinciding with seed maturity. But both the pollen itself and the mature seed, anecdotally speaking, seems very susceptible to excessive temperatures, which, even though this is a ventilated tunnel, it was a really hot string when this seed pollen was happening, and then another hot string heat wave when the seed was maturing, and we had very poor germination here. So just something to keep in mind, have good ventilation. If temperatures are getting much above 90, 95 degrees, that's not good for either pollen viability or for seed towards the end of its maturity. Because this is not nearly as easy as cutting umbels, we are waiting for entire plants to be about 2/3 mature when we're drying down. You can cut individual plants at 2/3 maturity. You can wait for the entire patch to be 2/3 maturity. There's variability as to how wide of an indeterminate window that is, how many weeks that this might ripen over a period of. Some beets that have less genetic diversity, for example, not always, but just as an example, they would oftentimes ripen over a shorter window. So you could very easily just wait till the whole patch was ready, 2/3 ready, and cut them all down. Others, especially older varieties with a lot more genetic diversity, they can be harvested over a longer window. So whatever's most convenient for you, feel free to go forth, harvest them, pull the whole plants or cut the stalks, and put them on a tarp. and let them continue to dry on that tarp in a cool, rodent-free place for another week and a half or 2 weeks. And then you have these long stalks, which I didn't have a good picture of, at least for beets and chard. What you see here is what we call beet seed or chard seed, but it's actually the fruit. Inside these little capsules, these fruits, there's anywhere between 2 and 5 seeds, which you may have noticed if you're ever sowing beet or chard seeds in little cells to transplant out, that somehow you put one seed in there, but there are a couple of little sprouts sometimes. That's what's going on there. There is in the commercial trade what's known as monogerm, which means the beet seed has either been decorticated or has been by one process or another made so that there's one fruit seed and one germination. But generally speaking, these have a couple seeds per fruit. And so you have these long stalks, right? They've dried down, and you can do one of two things. If it's a small lot, you can take a glove. We find the gloves that have that sort of rubber latex coating on are particularly well suited for this because they have friction. And you're taking that stalk and you're just stripping the stalk gently with your hands. Some dried leaves are coming off and blowing away, and all those seeds are just falling onto the tarp. So that's one way to do it. The other way, if you have a larger seed lot, is to put that pile together in a big enough pile. So like we talked before, when you're having the dance party that's coming up in just a moment, you're not stepping on the seed directly. There's enough critical mass inside that tarp that there's a buffer zone so that you can have your dance party. You fold that tarp over on that pile and you twist and shout. You do any kind of dance that speaks to your heart, or you just stomp to get the anger out of our present time in the world. Whatever it may be that helps, just with kind and honest intentionality, you can clean that seed with a big dance party. And then take all that material out, and what you'll be left with is a lot of really light leaf chaff material and these wonderful fruits that are pretty heavy, these seeds, so to speak. So they're a lot easier to winnow with a box fan or on a windier day because they're not blowing all over the place. So you can get these really nice and clean. And just, if it's for your home use, some chaff, this came up, I think, in lettuce and maybe in another session that we've done. It's not the end of the world if you don't get them squeaky clean, because if they're for your own use, in a sense, who cares? But hopefully they're coming from healthy, happy, disease-free plants. But anytime you are leaving some chaff in there, you're introducing the opportunity for any kinds of seed-borne diseases to linger with the chaff that you're leaving. So the cleaner, the better. And these are really easy to clean. So it's kind of a non-issue there. So lastly, we're going to talk about spinach. Spinach is a fun one. They're all fun. But spinach is a fun one because this is one of the very few examples in the most common vegetables of a dioecious plant. So when we talked about squash, we were talking about monoecious, meaning squash has 2 different types of flowers on any particular plant. One has the pollen, one has the bump and the ovary, and they need each other. So even though they're on the same plant, they're not a perfect flower. Spinach, a dioecious, Latin roughly for 2 households, means that there are separate plants. The one on the right here is a male plant that has pollen all over it. And the one on the left, which looks markedly different, is the one that has the stigma sticking up like little sticky hairs into the ground, into the sky, waiting to receive pollen and make fruit and make seed. Spinach pollen, like beets and chard, is very fine. Wind pollination is the name of the game. I've seen less insects attracted to spinach than beets and chard. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but according to some botanists, their flower is very unattractive, but I think that's a little offensive if you're a spinach plant. See here is pretty much the same as beets and chard. What's different here, did I even say this before I switched slides? I did not. Spinach, unlike beets and chard, is an annual. However, because spinach, particular types of spinach especially, are very cold hardy, there's no reason not to treat spinach like a biennial, recognizing that it does not need a period of fertilization. What I mean by that is a lot of us grow spinach in the fall, and spinach, if it's protected especially, can keep with a little cover or encouragement all winter. And so when we have saved spinach historically, like to select the following spring from fall plants for a number of reasons. We're selecting at the time where the greatest vegetation is there, so we can see a really nice full spinach plant and get a sense of what it wants to do as a plant. In the spring, spinach, when it reaches this crucial day period that we'll talk about in a second, can very quickly bolt. So you may have like a really small spinach plant that suddenly turns into a tall stalk. It's not giving you the same observational window to really look at what the leaves and the health and the yield and so forth of that spinach plant is doing. So that's one reason. Another reason is just to select for cold hardness, because the more greens we have that can grow over winter for us, geez, the better. So for that reason, we tend to treat it without digging it up in the vernalization process. We tend to treat it on our farm and our seed endeavors more like a biennial in the sense that we're growing it in the fall and we're overwintering it, either in a tunnel or outdoors. So I've said most of this. You can see that in population size, at least 10, because again, if you're planting 5 and 3 of them are female and 2 of them are male, you don't have a lot of pollen going on there. So you want to get at least 10 plants, and spinach plants aren't hard to crowd in. They can tolerate it. There are some circumstances where we see this with other plants, with cannabis, with jack in the pulpit, plants under certain stressful, strenuous circumstances, that was a mouthful, can change, can morph, and can allow themselves to produce pollen. They have that potentiality in there. It's not often, it's quite rare, but it can definitely happen, and especially be brought on by stress. So maybe somebody's out there saying, I planted 4 spinach plants and I got seeds so cute. And that could likely be what the case was, but it's especially important with dioecious plants like spinach, the more the merrier. Long day plant, you see this also in onions, short day, long day, which means there's a particular photo period that's required for it to do what it needs to do. So in the case of spinach needs this period, summertime, of 13 to 15 day length hours to initiate flowering. So if you lived in some strange part of the world I can't think of where that window did not happen coinciding with your spinach, I'm sure there's a place, I'm just not thinking of it, then there's a chance that your spinach may just stay spinach, which, from an eating perspective would be great. But you do need that period. And that's because that period coincides with summer. You want to time how you're planting your spinach, especially in spring. This is a kind of the limitation of gardeners who get spinach in too late in the spring. Let's say it's a really cold spring or the ground's super wet or it's just not relenting and you want to get in there and plant. You finally get your spinach in like end of April, early May, and then the little thing just bolts right away. And you say, oh, it's stressed. Well, it's stressed, probably, likely, but it also is getting closer to that initiating period right when it's coming into its own, where it has enough light that it's saying to itself, go ahead and make some flower seeds instead, because that's my thing. So similar harvesting technique to beets and chard. The name of the game is cutting and stripping whole branches or plants, with the exception being that obviously some of the spinach stalks are going to look like they don't have seeds on them because they don't. So you don't need to harvest all those stalks unless they're just like this beautiful tangled mess and you're just taking it all out and sorting it out later. There's no harm in doing that. But if you have enough space to be able to clearly see, which is optimal because you want airflow to prevent rot and various diseases. But what you see on the right here is an example of a spinach plant, a female ovular plant, where the pollen is taken and it's now producing spinach seed. And so that's what you want to be stripping off. So you can save yourself some time and labor if you just focus on the ones that have the obvious seed on them and you're not just stripping a whole bunch of chaff that you have to clean up. These seeds are also known as fruits, which I think is confusing. I wasn't sure why I put this in, but I just thought it was important because if you do see them listed as fruits, spinach, unlike beets and chard, one fruit is one single seed. So yes, they're a fruit, but they're also a seed. You want to make sure that they're nice and tannish brown before you're really harvesting things and taking them in to dry down. The milk stage, some people who've grown oats or other crops may be familiar with this, grains especially, where if you're squeezing that fruit and it's kind of translucent on the inside and a little milky, that means that the endosperm is not fully developed on the inside. It's not botanically ready yet. So you want it to turn tannish brown. You want to be able to pinch it and not have anything squirt out, basically. Processing and storage, same as beets and chard, very easy to clean. Winnow the chaff out, screen if necessary, give them a little squish test with a small tack hammer or something like that. It shatters, then you know it's ready for storage. And that's about it for spinach. Okay, well, I think we'll leave it there. Thanks very much, everybody. Hope to see some of you or most of you next week. Take care of yourselves, be well in the world, and save some seeds. Look forward to hearing how it goes for everybody.